Good afternoon, good day, everyone, wherever time zone you're joining us from. Welcome to RUSI's Terrorism and Conflicts team launch of the paper, The Contested Relationship Between Youth and Violent Extremism, which was authored by Claudia Weiner. I'm Dr. Jessica White. I am a research fellow on the Terrorism and Conflict team here. I also have looked into this subject and have been happy to see how this paper has progressed, and Claudia has done a great job authoring this paper. Just housekeeping, this event is being live streamed and is on the record. And please put any questions that you may have throughout the presentation is fine in the Q&A box, and we will have some time at the end for a Q&A session. So we'll hear today from Claudia, who authored the paper, from Dr. Mark Summers, and from Achalache Christian Leche. This paper is one of many as part of a prevention project series, which was a multi-year funded project funded by the Norwegian government. Several of the papers have already been produced, and they all look at what works and what doesn't for PCVE programming. So the effectiveness of different approaches or types of programming. We did use a public health model, so we're looking mainly at that secondary level of interventions of countering violent extremism. The literature includes, the whole project literature included over 540 documents. So it was a large sweep of both academic and gray literature. And it was sort of aggregated into key themes, which were analyzed to identify common assumptions and evidence for those assumptions around the efficacy of interventions. So some of the themes that have already been published on and are available on the RUSI website under the Prevention Project are women-centric interventions, PCVE communications, education initiatives, which Claudia also authored, and mentorship programs, and now the youth interventions paper. So I think let's go to Claudia first and allow her to present on her paper. Claudia is a research analyst in the Terrorism and Conflict group. Her research is focused on the countering violent extremism, with the focus also on far-right extremism. Prior to joining RUSI in 2018, she worked as a research assistant for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and also interned with Chatham House and the Austrian Embassy in London. Claudia has been a significant part of the Prevention Project. She's published 2 papers, as I mentioned, both centering around the question of youth and the programming that often targets youth. And she'll also be authoring a Lebanon case study research paper that's still forthcoming, as well as being a part of the final project summary. So Claudia, I'll hand it over to you for now.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen first. So give me a second. I hope you can see that now. So thank you so much, Jess, and thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. Really good to have you all here. As Jess mentioned, the publication on youth empowerment and PCVE that we're launching today is the 6th paper as part of the Prevention Project, and this is our 5th event discussing the evidence base for different thematic areas in PCVE. If you attended any of our previous events or read any of our previous papers in this series, you won't be surprised to hear that also with youth interventions to prevent and counter violent extremism, we had the issue that these interventions are typically not underpinned by a strong evidence base. And they've largely been developed on the basis of assumptions about why young people get engaged in violent extremism and how they get engaged in violent extremism. Now, we tried to gather the publicly available evidence that is out there, and we also tried to unpack the question of the relationship between youth and violent extremism a little. Now, given that we have a lot to get through, and I'm just going to summarize some of our key findings, and I'm happy to go into more in the Q&A later. Give me a second. Now, if you follow the news in the UK in the last couple of weeks, you'd have seen headlines like this. Whenever there's a particularly young person who gets arrested or convicted for terror-related crimes, this usually gets a lot of attention. People ask themselves why these young people get involved in violent extremism and how we can prevent this from happening, how we can prevent them from getting involved in these types of activities. And as a result, a lot of the interventions that we've examined as part of our prevention project, just mentioned over 550 publications, a lot of these focus on youth specifically. Now, because young people make up a relatively large proportion of those who join violent extremist groups, organizations, or who commit acts of terrorism, age is frequently identified as a risk factor or a predictor for engagement in violent extremism. And indeed, there are certain factors that are typically associated with youth as a kind of life course stage that can make young people more susceptible to violent extremist influences than other age groups. So, for example, some of the biological and psychosocial developments that individuals go through in this period of their lives can contribute to impulsivity and action orientation, which can make young people more likely than other age groups to engage in violent extremism, but also in other risky behaviors like joining gangs or committing other types of crimes. Youth is a phase of change and differentiation, and young people, they go through a search of identity and belonging, and they often come into contact with new peer groups, with new ideas and new influences in this phase of their lives. And similar to youth gangs, terrorist groups and networks can provide a sense of belonging and a sense of status, and they promise excitement and adventure, which can be quite attractive to certain young people. Situational factors also play a really important role in this. So one of the most significant situational factors is association with peers who are already involved in violent extremist activities. Now, this factor is really relevant for youth as opposed to other age groups because the influence of small peer groups is really strong in the phase from kind of early adolescence until the onset of adulthood, because people in this life phase are already relatively independent from the authorities of childhood, and they still don't have the responsibilities of adulthood. So they have a lot of time and resources to spend on their peer groups. And in this phase, small, really close-knit peer groups usually form between individuals who live in the same neighborhood. So physical space is really important in this, who go to the same school, the same church, the same mosque, madrasa, or who engage in the same activities in their free time, for example, football, bodybuilding, mixed martial arts training, etc. Now, there are many other risk factors that we could talk about, but what is really true about all of them is that the majority of people who experience them do not end up engaging in violent extremism. I think this is really important. This can be explained by the presence of protective factors, so factors that provide individuals with the resilience to reject violent extremism, even if they experience certain risk factors. I think that's really essential to note that, a lot of people experience one or more of these factors, and only a tiny fraction of these people actually end up engaging in violent extremism. So the cumulative impact of these factors should be understood in the context of kind of broader life course processes, with structural factors, individual factors, and protective factors kind of interacting with situational contexts and also with timing to kind of shape the pathways that individuals take in their lives. And this allows for a more nuanced understanding of vulnerability to extremist recruitment and radicalization than the focus on youth in general as a phase of vulnerability without kind of differentiating further. Such a nuanced understanding should also inform PCV interventions, so that the limited available resources for preventive programming can be allocated in the most efficient and impactful ways. But what we've seen in our research is that instead, youth agendas tend to adopt a highly securitized view of young people, particularly young males, that perceives them as a threat to peace and stability. And although this portrayal of youth as a security threat has been challenged in recent years, for example, through UN Security Council Resolution 2250 on youth, peace and security, and the UNDP's guiding principles on young people's participation in peace building, a real paradigm shift has yet to happen, definitely not seen as in the literature. We found that there's a tendency to view the motivations of young people as entirely separate from those of adults, which makes little sense as youth in some cultural contexts includes individuals up to the age of 40. So really, it's the differences between youth and adults are very blurry in some contexts. We found that interventions that are targeting youth are often based on a simplistic understanding of youth. So who's included in that broad concept of youth, and what motivates those young people, which means that interventions often struggle with targeting, and they fail to address the complex factors that drive young people to violent extremism. We also found that poorly targeted interventions can actually be really counterproductive, and they can contribute to the marginalization and stigmatization of project beneficiaries, particularly those that are already marginalized before the intervention, rather than actually empowering them, which is what the interventions are supposed to do or claiming to do. And of course, broadly considering young males as a potential security threat often means that interventions are actually wasting resources on young people who are really not at any risk of ever engaging in violent extremism. We did also find that based on these kind of simplistic assumptions about youth motivations, youth PCV interventions often assume that, for example, enhancing the self-esteem of young people or diverting their attention and their energy to positive activities such as sports or arts can in itself be effective in pulling those young people away from extremist influences. However, we found that the evidence base for these assumptions is really weak. And such activities can act as a platform for the relevant interventions by kind of allowing for regular engagement with these at-risk youth. But by themselves, they haven't really been found to affect the likelihood of individuals kind of engaging in violent extremism at all. Therefore, we argue that activities that are based on a reductive understanding of youth and their motivations might be valuable themselves, but they shouldn't be linked to PCVE agendas and the securitization that this link often entails in practice. Now, looking at the empowerment aspect of these interventions specifically, we found that a lack of economic opportunities, a lack of confidence, or lack of opportunities to participate in local decision-making, etc., are arguably relevant factors contributing to radicalization and recruitment into violent extremism in certain contexts. But interventions that purely based on one element of empowerment are also rarely effective. We found that actually, if they're poorly designed or implemented, these interventions may actually end up doing more harm than good. For example, economic empowerment interventions can create frustrations that can end up acting as factors that are contributing to radicalization when they create expectations about employment opportunities that remain unfulfilled after the end of an intervention. Now, what do we find about how to overcome these shortcomings? First of all, I think a more sophisticated targeting criteria. They're based on evidence on risk factors and resilience factors and their cumulative impacts, as well as locally relevant factors, are really needed to avoid those kind of overly broad targeting strategies that we've seen. This also underscores the need for a better understanding of youth motivations and a move away from kind of viewing the entire youth segment of the population as a potential terror threat. Aside from improving targeting practices, a step in the right direction would also be to acknowledge the agency of young people and their full range of grievances and frustrations. So rather than considering youths as threats or as victims only, activities should engage young people as partners and provide them with skills and opportunities to actively participate in PCV activities. Their participation can range from defining frustrations and grievances to identifying potential partners and working to tackle and resolve the grievances that exist in a certain context. But I think we'll hear much more about how youth can be involved in PCV in the next presentation, so I won't go into much detail about this. Also, because the risk factors for violent extremism are often multidimensional, it's never one factor that drives an individual to violent extremism. Interventions focusing on one aspect of youth empowerment only were not found to be particularly effective. And therefore, there's a clear need for interventions in this area to emphasize comprehensive and integrated and holistic approaches that address multiple risk dimensions at the same time, and are also based on a kind of thorough analysis of the local economic, social, political context and the needs that exist in a certain context. Lastly, we found that an improved and context-specific understanding of concepts such as gender and also community with regard to youth could really help to improve tailoring interventions to the intended target audiences. For example, we found that while interventions predominantly focus on young males, male-specific gender issues, including the links between masculinity and violence that persist in certain contexts, are not often addressed in youth-focused PCV interventions. And in order for interventions to address the full spectrum of driving factors of violent extremism, gender-specific issues of masculinity, emasculation, humiliation, and delayed or failed adulthood really need to be researched and integrated further in PCV interventions to make them more effective. So with that, I will pass back to Jess, and thank you all very much for listening. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Claudia. That was a very interesting overview of the paper, which of course there's much more to be found if you read the whole thing. It's very difficult to pack these giant papers into a short presentation. So for now, I think we'll move to Achaleke, who is a Cameroonian youth peace and security PCVE expert with 14 years of experience working within youth civil society, government, international organizations, and academic institutions. He currently serves as the executive director of Local Youth Corner Cameroon, one of the leading youth-led peace building and PCVE organizations in Cameroon. Achaleke has on-hand experience, working on the front line supporting the rehabilitation and reintegration of former violent and violent extremist offenders in Cameroon. He has also received several recognitions of his work, including being named among the 100 most influential Africans in 2021. He was also named the winner of the Luxembourg Peace Prize as Outstanding Youth Peacemaker, and also awarded as a Commonwealth Young Person of the Year in 2016, where he was received by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So I'll hand over to you now, please, Achaleke.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And it's a real pleasure to join this conversation. And, you know, Claudia has given an amazing presentation, an amazing summary of what this research is. And as a young person, conversations of this sort, it's always important to get our own perspective as young people, and the perspective or analysis I'll be giving conversation are not entirely just mine, but also resonating from the voices of other young people in the context of Cameroon. For example, Cameroon, as many of you would know, is faced by two forms of violent extremism from two parts of the country. We have the context of Boko Haram, which is in the far north region of the country, which spread from northeast Nigeria, and we have the recent issues in the English-speaking regions of the country, where we are seeing, you know, violent extremism being at the rise, on the rise in this localities. And from the conversation which Claudia, you know, started with, and the analysis which we have in this research, I feel that a lot of the conversations in there really tied to what we see on the ground. As someone working on the front line, I feel that, you know, some of the push factors and pull factors which he mentioned are very valid. It's what we are seeing on the ground every day. And, you know, adding to that, there are more issues around how, you know, security forces have also responded to the starting phases of this violent extremism in these communities, you know, like how they respond to maybe protests in the case of the English-speaking region of Cameroon has actually served as a contributing and radicalizing factor, you know, pushing young people to where they find themselves today. In the case of the far north region of the country, just to give you an idea of what it means to be a Kanuri young person, you know, you are tagged with the perception that, you know, you are Boko Haram no matter what, you know, just dressing in the white gondola as a young man, puts you at the crossroad of, brutalization, or you've been kicked and brutalized or even shot, just because of the fact that you are a young person, especially young male. The whole issue of masculinity is very important. I mean, these are some of the issues which are even making the situation much more complex. It's not justifying, why they decide to approach it from a violent perspective, or responding to some of these. The whole issue of peer pressure is very common. But another thing that we have seen is the whole issue of, the family, the role of the family. In most cases of some of the children that we speak to, or young people that we speak to who find themselves in this group, some of them have been pushed because of the fact that their parents, instruct them to be part of it. Because at some point, the way in which recruiters and those who are involved in the radicalization process twist their narrative really sometimes makes parents to, instruct their children or force them to be able to join these groups. We see the same thing in the English-speaking region, where they are tapping into identity issue about being, an Anglophone or a Francophone, and making you feel it's for an independent, having your country, and you see them, picking up arms. I mean, these are some of the issues which, I would just like to re-emphasize on. And, some of the structural factors which she highlighted are very, very valid. It's what we are seeing every day. And sometimes the misunderstanding is, holding on issues of economic deprivation, which the truth is, economic deprivation alone, cannot be a push factor. And that's why we see people who are even more wealthy, involving in this process. And sometimes it takes me back to academic conversations of persons like Collier, greed and grievances. At some point, I see these featuring with some few people who want to, maximize their wealth, what they have already, by supporting who will hardly die, who will never be on the field. And we see young people, many of whom are deprived of financial accruement or resources, and they find themselves at this crossroad. It is very true, but when we come to issues of interventions, and this is where I really feed into, because for the past 14 years of my work on the field, it has been around providing response to these push factors, to these pull factors, and to some young people who've already been part of it. As she rightly said, one of the issues is that young people are excluded in this intervention. And by exclusion, one of the things that we see is that usually in the design phase, young people are excluded. What we see sometimes is an initiative, an idea which works in the US, and they want to do the same thing in Cameroon without consulting young people. And usually we say anything for young people without young people is not for young people. And that is the truth. It's what we see every day. We've seen situations where we go on the field. Fortunately, my research, my master's dissertation was specifically on this conversation. And when you go on the field, speaking to some of these young people, and they tell you, we don't even know what, this project you are talking about is all about. We realize that this project is instead dividing us more than uniting us. This is because of the fact that the views of young people were not taken into consideration. The views of even some of the young people who have been part, of these groups were not taken into consideration. And that's where it takes us to a situation where implementation itself is already faulty. And this is also because of the fact that stakeholders who want to respond see young people not just as troublemakers or victims, but see young people just as beneficiaries, not as key partners. And that's where that challenge comes, where intervention is not owned by young people. A young Kanuri does not feel, important to respond. And that's what happens. And that's what violent extremist groups do all the time. Their narrative is making these young people feel important, trying to seek their consent, trying to make them understand they have a role to play. And this is where sometimes intervention fails. It brings me back to a key recommendation that stakeholders, donors, and partners need to understand that a design without young people is not for young people. Another very important part in intervention is around the monitoring, evaluation, and learning. What we see usually around interventions is that, an initiative is designed, young people are just brought, at some point to be part of the implementation, sometimes just to tick the boxes, not really involving them because they really believe in them. And at the end of the day, to look at the learnings, to look at the impact, they are not involved in this process of monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I mean, it is key because such processes make young people to feel ownership and to want to continue what is ended. Usually fundings are 1 year, 2 years. If it wants to be too good, it's 3 years. After 3 years, what happens? Donors will not always be consistent. So it is very important that young people are put at the forefront. And it brings me back to another conversation around financing youth-led responses. It's a big issue. If we look at, research around youth peace and security, you would see conversations talking about the fact that, over 60% of youth-led civil society organizations responding to peace and CVE are under $10,000 of annual budget. Now, $10,000 is not up to the salary of a project manager at the United Nations, for example. This is so much money. But we see young people continuously. We are saying we want them to be at the forefront, but we cannot finance their interventions. It is very important that in CVE, young people, youth-led initiatives should be financed, and young people should be given the trust. And that's why interventions are succeed. In context like commemoration, some vets are not given leadership position. Yet in response, we do not give young people the opportunity to lead and speak to their peers. It is young people who are found at the crossroads of this conflict. It is young people who are caught, recruited, radicalized. Why not support, invest in young people to be the solution providers? I mean, this is where we are failing. And from my interventions, from the work that I've been able to do, I can go to several examples of how just the fact that it is Achaleke or his colleagues who are all young people are speaking to an offender, the person looks at it differently because we have the same problem. Sometimes he will ask himself, why is it that Christian is also broke? Christian has been maltreated by the government. Christian maybe had been brutalized by the military, but has never used violence. Oh, if Christian would not use violence, and then why am I using violence? I mean, sometimes it is good that we take it from this angle. And, coming back to issues of solutions, I've highlighted so many of them already. It is very important that we are consistent with changing the narratives around engaging young people, not just as victims, looking at them as victims, but looking at them as key partners who can drive change themselves. It's very important. Investing in them. Today, group of young people are talking about having a fund specifically to support youth peace and security. I mean, these are the kind of conversations that should be amplified even right to local communities, because we need resources to be able to do this effectively. You will not imagine the amount of money which I used to start a program to prevent radicalization of children in the far north region of the country. I traveled to the United States, and after attending an event, I was given a per diem of $300. And I went to a Dollar Tree and purchased books and pens, and we went back to the country and we launched a free educational program called Salam Initiative, where we are helping children, many of whom have been used as suicide bombers, not to go back there by providing them an alternative. Today, this program has 150 children, and 20 of them have been successfully reintegrated back into school. This is $300. It's not up to 2 hours of working time for a staff in an international organization. It was able to bring change. I mean, there are many more evidence of how young people are driving change, are supporting change. We need to honor resources. But for how long are we going to hold on if we don't change this perspective? Just to add to Claudia to say that, what you've been able to put together, it's very strategic, very informative. And I feel that continuously we need to keep raising, the awareness about the role of young people and showing real-time, life-changing examples to inspire other young people and inspire also stakeholders. I mean, these were some of the thoughts which I wanted to share with you all coming from the field. And interestingly enough, most recently, I was still with some of these young people, and I feel that it's an increasing need that we need to support young people. We need to change the narrative, and we need to collaborate together, to ensure that we don't have young people recruited and radicalized as we are seeing every day. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating, I think, insight into a very on-the-ground perspective of this type of programming and how it's being done and how it could be done better. I think now we'll go to Mark, please. And Mark is a consultant and an Africanist and has a internationally recognized youth CVE peace building and conflict specialist. He served as a senior conflict advisor for the U.S. Department of State and a senior research advisor for the IGAD Center of Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism in Djibouti. Mark has provided strategic advice and conducted field research and evaluations in 22 war-affected countries. He also taught for many years at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Bellagio Center. He's an award-winning author also. His publications include Youth and the Field of Countering Violent Extremism and Trust-Based Qualitative Field Methods, a manual for researchers of violent extremism. So we are excited to hear, Mark, your perspective on this topic as well.
Thank you, Jessica and Claudia and Rusi, for inviting me to contribute to this event, and also for the spirited presentation from Achaleke. I really appreciated that, and Claudia's presentation as well was very informative. So let me, I wrote down a couple of notes when I was listening to both of them. The first one is, I think one thing that happens with this field is we lose sight on violent extremists and violent extremist groups and how good they are at their job, unfortunately. And I think we should never underestimate their expertise. That's going to come up in this presentation. And as Achaleke at one point suggested, we can learn from them actually, and how they promote empowerment for young people. They're good at it. And the other thing that is just a question that we can come back to, and that really links to this broader practice, is the following question: how do governments treat male youth? If we have a good answer to that, and if we can address that kind of issue, we can go a long way to addressing the kind of undercutting the attractions of violent extremist groups in this field of CVE. So I'm going to draw from this report I wrote called Youth in the Field of Countering Violent Extremism, and briefly highlight the 4 findings that surfaced in my research for that report. They concern youth, gender, community, and governance. So I'll go very quickly through them, starting with youth. So as Claudia very eloquently said, the overwhelming majority of people who become violent extremists are youth, most of whom are male. And at the same time, I think it's important to realize that even if PVE or CVE didn't exist, most youth wouldn't join a violent extremist group anyway. And so our starting point is actually very positive, as opposed to this securitized perspective of youth that Claudia rightly emphasized. Most youth resist joining violent groups, gangs, violent extremist groups, militias. They're peaceful and want to stay that way, most of them. That actually is not a big challenge for violent extremist groups. Their carrying capacity isn't very large anyway. But for us who work in CVE and PVE and work with states, it actually is a big deal. The way that male youths are targeted. If you're a Kanuri in northern Cameroon, for example, you're in trouble for doing nothing quite often. So it's problematic, and it's important for us to remember this. So what does one make of the field of CVE if most youth are already peaceful? There are lots of CVE initiatives that don't really have much to do with youth, even though the focus of recruitment is male youth, overwhelmingly by violent extremist groups. You have lots of initiatives that focus on women, on formal education, on counter messaging. That's very popular. But these are peripheral to the core issues of male youth and governance that seem to be the strongest with regards to what comes out of the research. And so a knowledge of what it's like to be a female and a male youth largely is missing from the field, especially for those young people in areas where the violent extremist groups operate, such as northern Cameroon. At the same time, violent extremist groups regularly display expertise about youth difficulties, youth challenges, youth empowerment. And while that expertise rarely shows itself, or infrequently shows itself among CVE practitioners. The idea that we can bring a standard program from one place to another should be questioned. Second, about gender is the second finding. I did some interviews with experts who were violent extremist and CVE experts. I also did interviews for a book called The Outcast Majority with development experts. And I found the same thing, which is implicitly in both fields of CVE and development, the implicit meaning of gender is women. Ask any minister, government minister in Africa, I think you'll find that, for example. While the main implicit meaning of youth is male youth. So there's two things to think about, I think, immediately on this. The first is that where are female youth in this equation? They're sort of junior members of both sets. They're little subsets. They're not important. That's ridiculous. And that's counterfactual and actually counterintuitive. But that's how these fields work. We're bound by these concepts and these ideas that these are separate streams, youth and gender. And so, but the broader landscape, the broader landscape where gender can be separated from youth. I mean, think about that. For a young person, gender is so important. Who am I? Those are gendered ideas. Masculinity, femininity, becoming a man, becoming a woman. So separating those out is profoundly counterproductive, and we unintentionally undercut or weaken the work we have to do. So to get to male youth, they're by far the prime targets for recruitment by violent extremist groups. So one might think that prominent gender concerns for male youth, like emasculation, like fear of failing to gain recognition as an adult man, would be central to PVE and CVE research and practice, but they're not. And that is, from the outside, is kind of surprising, but that's just what the research indicates. So CVE research and initiatives largely connect gender issues to women, and masculinity issues tend to be either secondary or non-existent. You can't find much research on CVE or violent extremism connected to emasculation. In sharp contrast, members of VE groups regularly demonstrate gender expertise in their recruitment of female and male youth. When they target a male youth, it's gender focused, it's gender specific. Same for female youth. And that gender expertise is not met in general by our field in response. The gender experts, unfortunately, are on the other side for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part. I don't think there are many VE group recruiters who don't have gender expertise in what they do. So the third main finding is about community. Now it's common, it's popular to talk about we're going to work through the community, but think about that phrase. Working through the community often means working through powerful men who control communities, or powerful women, but and the dynamics, that the idea of community often implies that they're functional and that they are inclusive. I think Acheleke pointed out the issue of exclusion, and so did Claudia in her presentation. Communities can be dysfunctional. They can be exclusive. And there are leaders who sideline lots of youth. You know, a lot of leaders are not that popular with young people. So this is not surprising. When you hear of a program that says we work through the community, a big question mark should go up in your mind, because a lot of those leaders that you work through are unpopular and can be actively marginalizing a lot of the young people. Unintentionally, what is that doing? It's pushing them straight to the violent extremist recruiters, making their job easier. Nobody's intending that. But I think we have to really question the idea of what a community is and who belongs to it and who doesn't. So the final issue is governance. Evidence that poor governance fuels the spread of violent extremism is absolutely overwhelming. And here are 5 trends, which I think we're all familiar with. I'll just name them. So what are these trends that play into the hands of violent extremist groups concerning governance? Well, states that ignore, exclude, or attack marginalized or pariah groups, such as the Kanuri, such as the Fulani, such as the Somalis. States that criminalize peaceful dissent, states that and their international allies that securitize support for civil society, for communities, for youth, as Claudia pointed out, for women and other parts of our society. States that extort and illegally detain citizens, use heavy force against particular ethnic groups or male youth in particular locations. In the Journey to Extremism by the UNDP, which is a really terrific report, it found overwhelmingly that that's the main cause, is the governance issues. That's what drove youth in Africa towards violent extremist groups. 71%, I think, that was the main reason. So another one is that international actors, this is a big one, that provide heavy military and intelligence assistance to states. There's a piece I wrote with Eric Rosand about this recently. This is so counterproductive to have a security-first approach towards violent extremist groups, to feed more support to very violent states who often use that support to go and beat up marginalized groups, frankly. And again, that makes it a lot easier. No surprise, in West Africa, violent extremism is expanding at a rate that's unprecedented. And it has to do with, to a large degree, with the behavior of states. So finally, we know that corrupt, repressive states fuel the spread of violent extremism. We know it. Yet a prominent trend in CVE and CT action is not to address these serious governance issues, to kind of tiptoe around them, to work on the sides, to do a little bit of training, but to not really center on that. So how do governments, as I said, treat youth and marginalized groups? How can that be changed? These are big ideas. I just want to mention in closing that this is a very important field, CVE and PVE. It's not done that well. If it was, I think our presentations would be far more upbeat in general. You know, the common approach to youth in CVE generally is unstrategic. The common approach to gender in CVE generally is very narrow. The common approach to communities tends to lean on assumptions that may be false. And the common approach to governance challenges generally is tentative. So we have a lot to do on these fields in this field of CVE or PVE. And I think it starts with addressing serious governance challenges and keeping the kinds of youth that VE groups target at the center of our efforts. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was, I think, a very interesting summary of some of the serious challenges that this field faces. And I think you actually answered in your presentation some of the questions that have already been put in the Q&A to some degree. I want to note, you know, sort of, I think we've ended on a downer here of how many difficulties we still face, but I think it's actually today's presentation about the things that have been done with such a little amount of resource and you know, in Cameroon, I think is important to remember that these can have positive effects and to look for ways to increase the viability of those positive effects. We do have quite a few questions in the Q&A, and I think we'll try and get to some of them here, although we may not be able to get to all of them. I apologize in advance if yours are the ones that have been missed. But I think, you know, one to start with sort of, and maybe this goes to Claudia, first of all, is sort of, there's a question here about, you know, whether entertainment activities, for example, are used as, you know, being used as an opportunity to bring together youth from different backgrounds and maybe give them an opportunity to collaborate amongst themselves or with public authorities. Does that have any, are there evidence for those kinds of interventions to either improve the horizontal intergroup relationships or vertical relationships between youth and the states, therefore being a, you know, successful example of PCVE? I think this question is often put in relation to sporting type interventions as well. I don't know if you have an answer that you might want to give to that, Claudia.
Sure. So kind of on the field of diversionary and kind of entertainment activities in general, as I said in my presentation, the evidence altogether is very limited. So interventions that really only focus on the entertainment and the diversionary aspect of this, I think really miss an aspect that actually Mark has mentioned in his presentation, namely that the violent extremist organizations are extremely good at targeting young people. I think if you think that young people only turn to violent extremism because they're bored, because that's really the underlying assumption of a lot of these interventions, you really don't take into account the really creative strategies these organizations use. People don't just turn to violent extremism because they don't have anything else to do. So I think focusing on that aspect only is just not really very, very effective. We have seen more evidence, as I said in my presentation, if you combine this with mentorship, for example, and with other kind of regular engagement that actually works on reducing some of those other risk factors. Now, with regard to intergroup contact, this is actually something that I've mentioned in my previous paper on education and PCVE. On intergroup contact and kind of reducing violent extremism through contact between conflicting groups, I think the evidence is also quite mixed. I think we generally found evidence that yes, by bringing together members of different conflicting groups, you can improve their opinions of each other and reduce prejudice. But I think it's questionable whether this opening toward one group really translates to a wider opening and a reduction in kind of violent extremism, or reduction in kind of likelihood to engage in violent extremism. No, this was quite a long question, so I forgot the second part. I believe there's another part of this at the end.
I think the second part was sort of, has it ever been shown to sort of improve relationships, not only between youth groups, perhaps disparate groups that might be participating, but also maybe between youth and this sort of government level or state level, the vertical relationships?
Well, I think this really depends on who's implementing the intervention, and also kind of what the content of the intervention is. I think I can't really give a one answer for this question in general, but I think, yes, there have been some examples of this happening, but again, with kind of integrating other elements into that activity. If the activity is really just football practice twice a week, I have not found any evidence that this improves the relationship with the state or with anyone else. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Achille, did you want to say something about this as well?
Yes, as I said, my perspectives are from what we have seen and what is working. And I think entertainment, sports has a very key role to play, especially in contexts where one of the drivers of violent extremism is around mistrust between young people, communities, security forces, justice system. In the context of the Boko Haram in the Fano region of the country, we have seen that this issue of mistrust is at the core. And we've seen how sports is becoming a much more a bonding opportunity, the kind of sports where these different stakeholders have opportunity to play together. We are starting a project with Search for Common Ground, so with support from the US Embassy on this note, where we are using sports, football, for example, to be able to bring security, administrative, and young people together to play together. And my experience of these as a young person itself. So because one of the things I do, and why it's important to have young people in design, is that sometimes I wear the shoe. I put myself in that young person's shoe, that how would I feel if a state prosecutor, or what we call a magistrate, or a procurer would play football with me, in the same pitch, we share the same ideas, we rub our sweat, together, because sometimes it is the way in which the governance structure has been put that creates this mistrust, and the roles, people don't understand each other's roles and everything. I support Claudia to say the way in which you do it is also important. In our work in prison, for example, when we want to start our football match, what we do is that we look for an inmate who comes and talks about a core value when it comes to peace. For example, we talk about maybe justice. So we teach them that they can find solutions to their own problems. And sometimes it builds self-esteem, it strengthens collaboration, which is one of the key things when it comes to drivers. So I think that entertainment, even music, has a key role to play. Even movie, has a key role to play. We are working around, young people and these stakeholders to develop content which we would be able to use within community through community projections and all of that. I think Search for Common Ground has great evidence around these, even TV shows and all of that. I think they have a key role when it comes to communicating to people innovatively. Sometimes they are on social media where young people usually find themselves, to be able to break misconceptions, issues around propaganda, around fake news and misconceptions, which really sometimes surrounds the amplification of the push or the pull factors. I mean, this is the kind of experience that we've had, and we feel that, these are some examples of what we can amplify.
Thank you. I think that's some really good on the ground perspective on that question, because sometimes it's quite difficult, with the publication of evidence and if we can gather the evidence that really shows one way or the other. So it's good to hear from that perspective of somebody who's actually doing that in real life. And I think, the next question kind of is somewhat related. Actually, like you made the point in your presentation about the importance of including youth in youth programming, and they need to be involved, throughout all the phases. So a couple of questions we had, I'm collating a couple of different people. So, one person mentioned that they had seen some of this in some programs in Iraq where they had been tried to include the youth, but perhaps the youth had been subject to a higher level of expertise or mentorship where they really didn't have the final say. They were asked for their perspectives, but they didn't really, they were sort of pressured to do it in a certain way, or and whether their voices get lost in sort of the high level implementation of programming. So I think, the question, maybe this can go to Mark first and then come to you, Achileke, from your experience. Can you give us any examples of a program where you thought, yes, this did it really well, this included the youth, throughout all the phases and really had a good outcome?
It's a complicated, thanks for the question. It's a complicated issue. I think for evaluation. So when Achileke talks rightly about the issue of exclusion, most youth will never get in a program. They're very small. They include few people. And since exclusion is such a big deal, every evaluation, in my view, of a CVE program should focus mainly on the impact of the program on people who can't get in it. Because if they want to get into a good program, if it's a good program, people will want to get into it. And then if there's demand and they can't, what's the impact of your program on people who can't get in? So why is that important? Because if you have a good program in an area where violent extremist groups are, they're going to know. Their surveillance is extraordinarily good from what I can tell. And so in that environment, the people who can't get in are easy pickings, I would think, for violent extremist recruiters. So this is the dynamic that we're working in. A good program that has a high unit cost might have a negative impact for those who can't get in. I don't know that for sure, but I think we need to be concerned about this as opposed to evaluations who just do their outputs. Who cares? This is about violent extremism. I mean, really, the bigger issues have to do with broader outcomes and impact on people who don't get in. So the symbolism in a place where few people can get into a program, it's important to know the most important thing is who gets in and who doesn't. How strategically targeted are you? If relatives of the chief gets into the program, what's the point of your program? I don't care how good it is. You've got the wrong people in there, then you're giving the wrong signal to people who aren't there. So I think that's a broader point here. Don't lose track in my view, of violent extremist groups and how they operate and their level of expertise. And a final point on this is, in talking and working at EGAD, I got to talk to a lot of people on the front lines doing really dangerous work in CVE in Kenya and Somalia. And I asked them, what's a sign of a good program? And they said, how do you know that you have a really good program? And I was talking to Kenyans in Wajir, working in Wajir and on the coast, places where Al-Shabaab definitely is, and then inside of Somalia. And they gave me the same answer. If you have a good program, then Al-Shabaab you'll know that it's a good program, because Al-Shabaab will find a way to get your mobile cell phone number, and they'll start texting you and saying, we're watching you, we know where your children go to school, where you know where your wife goes to work, things like that. That's the sign of impact. And so I think it's important to realize a lot of CVE programs can be very good, but they're not in areas where violent extremists are. And so they're really more of a preventive measure, which is a good thing, or a development kind of approach, which is not bad either. But in places where it's hot, that's complicated. And I think we need to think very seriously about how violent extremist groups think, and also this idea of youth ownership in a program, I think, and the issue of who gets in and who doesn't. Those seem to be the most important ones.
Thanks, Mark. I don't know, actually, I think we're running out of time, but do you want to take a couple minutes and tell me if you sort of think, of a good example or what your response is?
Yeah, I think that what Mark said is, you see, I was smiling because it's what we see every day. When your program is so nice, you receive a call or you get a threat. It's the fact about it. And sometimes it's very scary. It seems like you should let go. But I mean, I think continuously things are changing, especially when young people are leading such processes. We try as much as possible to ensure that we have legitimate voices. And by legitimate voices, we mean even some of these young people who are even more vulnerable, because sometimes what happens in the inclusion of young people, even in design, is that they find a small group of elitist young people, and yet you don't get the right voices, And I take an example, UNESCO, the regional office has been working around setting up early warning mechanism. And, I was brought on board. Probably because of my experience. But at some point in time, one of the things I did was, even though not every young person could come on the table for the design, one of the things I did was also consulting with my peers who I think they are more vulnerable, speaking to some of them who have been part of the DDR program, who have been at the front line and bringing their voice, to the table. I mean, this comes as an advocacy to my peers, some of whom should be joining this conversation. If it's too difficult to have many of these voices, let us serve as intermediaries. Let us ensure that we represent credible voices. And that's what we saw in that project right from design. It was for the PBF funding, and we took part in the designing process. And I ensured that most of the perspectives that I was sharing, some of the worries, some of the misconceptions were coming from my peers who are on the ground. And we took part in the implementation phase. I remember I received a participant list, which did not include some key stakeholders. And I wrote back to UNESCO and said, I would not be able to do this job because some people are excluded from it. And they said, how? And I explained to them that sometimes when it comes to selection, they will pick people who are their cousins, their friends, and their brothers, not people who are really, really there. Another advocacy is that we should be very steadfast as young people when we get into these phases. Sometimes let's say what we need to say and do what we have to do. And that list was changed. And unfortunately, we had these very credible young people who are from the field who suffer the most in the implementation phase, and we could see a difference, and we're hoping that in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning, this same kind of group of young people, this same vision of standing for our own, in this process should be upheld. If not, young people will continuously be excluded, especially the voices who really suffer. I tell you, these groups they have sweet tongue. If they want to convince you, you will not imagine. They know your problems even better than those who are coming to solve. And that's where they get young people. And I think that we can only change this narrative by also being able to sweet talk them, by also looking at their problems and responding to it the way in which, if we were in their shoes, we would want to be responded to. I mean, these are some of my thoughts which I wanted to share on this note. Thank you.
Yeah, I think thank you very much, everyone, for your responses. But I think that's a great point, and we should think about walking a mile in their shoes, right? And what would make the most sense if we had put ourselves in the positions of trying to do these in the right way. I am very sorry to say that we have a lot more interesting questions that we didn't get to, but I really do appreciate the input from all the panelists and all of the people who have offered their questions. And I hope that the report has helped spark some good conversations around how to improve practice in this area of preventing and countering violent extremism. I will just say very quickly, I know we're running out of time, but there are a couple more pieces coming up from the prevention series left to have, and there will be country studies with some research from the ground presenting from Lebanon and Kenya that will come next, and then there will also be a final wrap up of the whole prevention series. Next week, we are also having a launch event on the 24th of February, which will cover some very similar topics to this, sort of effectiveness of CT and PCVE programming, and it covers youth engagement, rehabilitation and reintegration, as well as capacity building of national governments and law enforcement agencies. So if those topics are of interest to you, please do go ahead and sign up for the event next week as well on the 24th of February from 10 to 11:30 GMT time. Thank you all for your participation today, and I